I had always been cautious about the boundaries I set with people, especially with anyone close to my family. As a mother, it was essential to keep things appropriate. Even more so when it involved someone as close to my son as his best friend Jake. Jake had practically grown up in our house, spending countless nights, weekends, and even holidays with us. I always treated him like one of my own, but lately things had changed. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint directly, just small moments, subtle shifts in the way he looked at me. All the way our conversations lingered just a bit too long. Jake was no longer the boy who used to hang out with my son and leave his shoes scattered by the door. He was now a young man, confident, composed, and aware of the power he held over people, including me. One evening, everything seemed to culminate. My son had gone out with some friends, leaving Jake at our house. As he often did, I didn't think much of it, especially since it wasn't uncommon for Jake to stay behind. When my son was out, we were comfortable around each other. Too comfortable, perhaps. I was in the guest room, looking for a book I'd stashed away a while back. I heard the familiar creak of the floorboards as Jake walked past the room, but I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, I noticed him standing in the doorway. "Need any help?" he asked, casually leaning against the frame with a slight smile on his face. I shook my head, my back still turned toward him. "I'm just looking for an old book." "You're fine." But he didn't leave instead. He stepped inside his presence, filling the small space. I felt my pulse quicken slightly, though I told myself it was nothing. This was Jake, my son's best friend. Yet there was something undeniably different about the way he carried himself, how he moved toward me when I finally turned around. I saw a glint of something in his eyes, something that made me feel more vulnerable than I cared to admit. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. I was acutely aware of how close we were standing, closer than we should have been. My mind raced, trying to find a way to break the tension that had thickened between us. But before I could say anything, Jake spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You know, I've always admired you," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "You're not like other moms," I blinked, taken aback by the compliment. But also by the way he said it. There was an underlying meaning in his words, a boldness that was hard to ignore. "That's sweet of you to say, Jake," I responded, trying to keep my tone light, though I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. But the intensity in his eyes didn't waver. Instead, he took a step closer, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Suddenly, I realized that this situation was quickly heading toward a place I wasn't prepared to go. I swallowed hard, searching for the right words to diffuse the moment. But Jake wasn't giving me any room to breathe. He stood there, his eyes locked onto mine, waiting for some kind of response. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt an uneasiness settling into the pit of my stomach. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This was Jake, my son's best friend. How had we gotten here? "I think you should go, Jake," I finally said, my voice firmer than I expected. I could feel the tension tightening between us, but I knew I had to keep control of the situation before it spiraled into something I couldn't fix. Jake didn't move right away. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, as if weighing his options. For a moment, I wondered if he would leave, or if he was about to cross a line that neither of us could uncross. Then he took a breath and leaned back slightly, breaking the intensity of the moment. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "It's okay," I replied, that my mind was still racing. "I just think it's better if we don't." I paused, searching for the right words. "If we don't cross any boundaries. You know," he nodded slowly, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Disappointment, maybe, or regret. It was hard to tell either way. The moment passed, and the tension seemed to ease, if only slightly. "I get it," Jake said after a long pause. "It's just, He hesitated as if deciding whether or not to say what was on his mind. "It's just that sometimes I feel like we're more alike than you think." I followed my brow at that, not sure what he meant. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes briefly drifting to the window before meeting mine again. "You're different from the other adults I know. You actually listen, you actually care. It's easy to talk to you," I sighed softly, understanding what he was trying to say, but also feeling the weight of what he was implying. Jake was young, still figuring out the world, still navigating emotions that he didn't fully understand yet. I had to be the adult in the room, the one who kept things from veering into dangerous territory. "I appreciate that, Jake," I said gently, "but you have to understand I'm your friend's mother. That's a line we can't cross." He gave me a small, almost sad smile. "I know," he said quietly. "Taking a step back, I just wanted you to know how I feel." For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for him. It wasn't easy to open up like that, especially when the feelings were so complicated. But I also knew that no matter how he felt, I couldn't let things get any more complicated than they already were. "Thanks for telling me," I said, trying to soften the blow. "But we need to keep things where they are." Jake nodded, though I could see the struggle in his eyes. He wasn't used to rejection, especially not from someone he admired. But to his credit, he didn't push any further. Instead, he turned and left the room, leaving me standing there, heart still racing, wondering what had just happened. I exhaled deeply, feeling the tension slowly drain from the room. But even as I tried to shake it off, I couldn't help but wonder if this would be the last time Jake would make such a bold move. Something told me this wasn't over. Not yet. The days following that tense encounter was strangely quiet. Jake still came over, still spent time with my son. But there was an unspoken shift in the air between us. He avoided lingering too long when we crossed paths, and our interactions, though polite, felt stilted. I had hoped that our conversation had put everything to rest, that Jake would let go of whatever it was that had been bubbling under the surface. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before something happened again. One evening, about a week later, I was home alone. My son had gone on a camping trip with a few friends, and my husband was working late, leaving me with the house to myself. I welcomed the quiet and decided to enjoy the rare moment of solitude with a glass of wine and a good book. It wasn't long before I heard the doorbell ring. I frowned, not expecting anyone. But when I checked, there he was, Jake standing on the porch. I opened the door, confused. "Jake, what are you doing here? Isn't my son with you on the trip?" He looked sheepish, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, he is. I wasn't really feeling up to it, though, so I stayed back. I hope it's okay. I just wanted to stop by and say hi." I hesitated, not sure what to make of his sudden appearance. Everything inside me screamed that this wasn't a good idea, but I couldn't exactly turn him away. After all, he'd been a part of our family for so long, and I didn't want to make things more awkward than they already were. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in." Jake walked in, glancing around the empty house. "Where's your husband?" "He's working late," I replied, closing the door behind him. "So it's just me tonight." The moment I said it, I realized how it sounded, how it must have felt to him. I quickly moved to change the subject. "Can I get you something to drink?" He shook his head no. "I'm good, thanks." We stood there for a few seconds, an awkward silence hanging between us. I could feel the tension creeping back, the same tension that had filled the guest room not too long ago. I mentally prepared myself, determined to keep things light, to avoid falling into the same trap as before. I was just about to relax for the night, I said, hoping to give him an easy out. "It's been a long week. Mind if I hang out for a bit?" Jake asked, his voice casual, but with an undertone that made my pulse quicken. "I don't really feel like being alone right now." I froze for a second, my instincts telling me to find an excuse, to create distance before things took a turn. but the softer part of me, the part that still saw him as the boy who had grown up in my home. "Went out, sure." I replied slowly, "But just for a little while, okay?" He smiled that same disarming smile he always used, and I felt my guard drop ever so slightly. We sat down in the living room, him on the couch and me in the armchair across from him. I kept the distance between us, hoping it would set a clear boundary. We started talking about small things, school, his plans for the future, casual topics that felt safe. But as the conversation went on, I noticed that same intensity in his eyes. The way he looked at me, with a mixture of admiration and something else I couldn't quite name. At one point he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said, "You know, it's different talking to you than it is talking to my friends. You get me in a way they don't." I shifted in my seat, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. "I'm sure your friends understand you more than you think." "No," Jake shook his head. "Not like you actually listen. You don't judge me." I tried to steer the conversation away, sensing where it was headed, but Jake wasn't done. His eyes were locked onto mine, and before I could say anything, he spoke again, his voice low. "Sometimes I think if things were different." I knew where this was going. I'd seen the look in his eyes before, heard the edge in his voice. But this time we were alone. This time there were no boundaries, except the ones I would have to enforce myself. "Jake," I said, my voice firmer now, "you need to stop." But he didn't. Instead, he leaned back on the couch, a conflicted expression crossing his face. "I know, I can't help how I feel." I stood up, trying to put physical distance between us. The air was thick with tension, and I knew that if I didn't put an end to this right now, we were teetering dangerously close to a line we couldn't come back from. My mind raced, weighing what to say next. But Jake's eyes followed my every movement, full of a longing that unsettled me. "Jake, this needs to stop," I said, my voice steady that my heart was pounding. "We can't, this isn't right." He stood up, to not closing the gap between us, but still standing too close for comfort. "I know it's not right," he said, his voice soft, "but I can't pretend that I don't feel something when I'm around you." His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to confront what he was feeling. But there was no place for this, no space where it made sense. I had to be the adult, had to be the one to bring this to a halt, before things spiraled out of control. "You're confused," I said, my voice firm now. "What you're feeling isn't real. You're young, and this is just a phase." Jake's expression hardened slightly at that. "A phase? You really think this is just some crush?" "Yes," I insisted. "It's a crush, Jake. Nothing more, and it'll pass." He shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's not just a crush. I'm not a kid anymore. I know what I feel, and you feel it too. I've seen the way you look at me." My breath caught in my throat. This was going too far, way too far. "No, Jake," I said quickly, "you're misreading everything. This isn't what you think." But he wasn't listening. "You can deny it all you want, but I know you feel it too. I'm not imagining this." I needed to end this conversation. I couldn't let it go any further. Couldn't let him convince himself of something that wasn't true. "Jake, please," I said, my voice bleeding now. "You need to leave. This is wrong, and it can't happen ever." There was a long pause as we stood there, neither of us moving, both of us caught in the intensity of the moment. Finally, Jake took a step back, his expression pained but resigned. "I get it," he said quietly. "I'll go." He turned and headed toward the door, and for a moment I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This was over, it had to be over. But just before he left, he turned back one last time, his eyes meeting mine with a look that was both sad and determined. "Just so you know," he said, his voice steady, "this isn't going to go away." And with that he left, closing the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, trying to process everything that had just happened. I knew I'd done the right thing, but the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on my chest. How had things gotten so complicated? How had Jake, the boy who had been like a second son to me, developed feelings that I never anticipated? In the days that followed, I replayed the events over and over in my mind, questioning if I had handled it the best way, wondering if I could have done more to prevent it. But no matter how much I agonized over it, the truth remained. Jake was my son's best friend, and the boundaries we had almost crossed could never be mended. I avoided him as much as I could after that. Whenever he came over to see my son, I made sure I wasn't around. I couldn't risk another encounter, couldn't risk letting those emotions surface again. But even though I did my best to create distance, I knew things would never be the same. Jake had made his feelings clear, and while I had drawn the line, I couldn't shake the sense that something unresolved still lingered between us. The weight of it all stayed with me, a reminder of how easily things could have gone differently, and how close we had come to crossing a line that neither of us could ever come back from.